This program is sponsored by the Church of God International and supported by our viewers.
In the book of Revelation, it describes four horsemen that are responsible for distributing some very troubling conditions upon the earth. These plagues are destined to result in so much destruction. We are told about a white horse of deception and a red one for war, a black horse for famine and pestilence, and yes, a pale one for starvation, chaos, and death to 25% of humankind. A horrific description of ravaging plunder and catastrophic carnage. With the backdrop of many epidemics and pandemics, the pale horse is of particular interest. Yes, human history has recorded a legacy of viral pandemics over the centuries, resulting in millions of people dying of disease and infection. And shockingly, research and studies are conducted daily by different nations of the world to study the many diseases and viruses that come from animals such as pigs and bats, rats, and other rodents, and yes, even monkeys. And sometimes not only for developing a vaccine, oh no, but instead investigating techniques which might be developed for acquiring a gain-of-function protocol to weaponize these viruses. So stay with us as we explore the effects of the pale horse on today's program.
In times like these, we need the armor of God for the well-being of our families, to help you stand in the evil day. The Church of God International presents Armor of God, a program of biblical understanding. And now your host, Mike James.
Hi, welcome to another edition of the Armor of God. We're glad you could join us for today's program. I want to call this program The Pale Horse. And the reason I'm going to use that title is I'm going to look at what we read about this pale horse in Revelation chapter 6. We're going to connect what is said about the pale horse in Revelation 6 to what Jesus had to say about the end times when he spoke to his disciples, primarily in Luke chapter 21 and in Matthew chapter 24. Now, what we know about this pale horse is the pale horse is a reference to pestilence pandemics that will come upon the earth right before the second coming of Jesus Christ. And we've had pandemics throughout our earthly history. We've had the COVID-19 pandemic. We've had the various plagues of the Middle Ages. We've had the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920. And when you look at these various pandemics, whenever they have arisen, people have thought it might be the end of this age. But what we need to do is look historically at what has happened in the past to help us understand what may be happening in the present. When we look at something like the COVID-19 pandemic, we see that the numbers there are not as great as what occurred in 1918 to 1920. 50 million people died in that 1918 to 1920 pandemic worldwide. 675,000 Americans died. Half of those who died within a 4-month period of time. And when we look further back in history at the plagues of the Middle Ages, we see that the second plague in the 1300s took 75 million people on this earth. So those numbers help us understand where we might be when we have to go through pandemics in more recent history. Now, having said all that, it is terrible and it is tragic for anyone who dies due to a pandemic. But let's get specific today about what we can learn from that fourth horseman of the apocalypse, the pale horse. What can we learn in those details of what is said there in Revelation 6 when we connect it to Jesus' words to His disciples in Luke 21 and Matthew chapter 24? Before we do any of that though, what I'd like to do is offer you some free CDs on today's program. Please order The Pale Horse, which will look in detail at the subject matter that I am getting into on today's program. We also want you to get the CD, Clean and Unclean Meats. When you look at the history of pandemics, what you will find is the source of most of the pandemics that have raged on the earth were an unclean animal source. Whether it was a rat for the bubonic plagues or whether it was a bat for the COVID plagues, you will find that unclean animals have a connection to these pandemics. Learn more about the pale horse rider. Learn more about clean and unclean meats by ordering these 2 CDs. To get these CDs free of charge, all you need to do is call us toll-free at 1-888-578-8791. That's 1-888-578-8791, or you can order by visiting our website. Go to www.cgi.org. That's www.cgi.org. When you go to that website, be sure to download our literature there also at www.cgi.org. We also have a weekly sermon broadcast each Sabbath. All you need to go to is our website, that's cgi.org. And also, if you haven't yet downloaded our CGI Digital Network app, you can do so by downloading it at the Amazon App Store, Google Play, or the Apple App Store. Once again, thanks for joining us on today's program. We're looking at the pale horse rider that we read about in Revelation chapter 6. And we're going to look at that at some detail and compare it to some of the pandemics that have occurred in our Earth's history. What can we learn from what we read about in Revelation, in Luke chapter 21, in Matthew chapter 24, when it comes to pandemics that we've experienced in the past and that we will experience in the future? Now, speaking about these pandemics, we've seen one in 1918 to 1920 that was called the Great Influenza. That pandemic gives us a lot of information that I believe relates to the final pandemic that will occur on this earth preceding Jesus Christ's second coming. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take a look right now at Revelation chapter 6. And I want to get into a little bit of detail here as we read Revelation 6. Let me focus in on a couple verses here to get things started. Revelation 6, verse 7. And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth. Now get this, power was given over the fourth part of the earth. What kind of power? To kill with sword, with hunger, and with death. Now the word death there in some Bible translations, it is translated pestilence. Same thing, pestilence causes death. and with the beasts of the earth. That's an interesting phrase. How do the beasts of the earth play a part in the sword, the famine, and the pestilence? We'll touch on that a little bit later. But let me just talk about something that it says here, that this pandemic, this sword, this famine, this pestilence is going to kill a fourth part of the earth. What does that mean in layman's language? That means about 25% of the world's population will be decimated before Jesus Christ comes back to this earth. Now, when you think of those numbers, we've got 7.8 billion people on the earth right now. Let's round it up to 8 billion. What's a quarter of that? That's 2 billion people. Think of the enormity of the death that will come right before the second coming of Christ. When you look back at the 1918 to 1920 pandemic, about 50 million, maybe 100 million dead. That compares not at all to what's going to happen before Christ's second coming. Even when you go back to the bubonic plagues of the Middle Ages, the second plague being the worst one in the 1300s, 75 million to possibly 200 million people died. That doesn't compare to these types of numbers. When we split the sword, the famine, and the pestilence 3 ways between 2 billion people, you come up with 600 to 700 million people dying by those various means. That blows away anything we've experienced in our Earth's history. So this time of the end is a time like no other in the Earth's history, and we can't let things that happen within our present history affect us when we know what history is and we know what's coming out there in the future. Now, having said all that, I want to take a closer look at what is being said here in Revelation chapter 6 in comparison to Jesus' words in the gospel accounts. Let me first turn to Luke chapter 21, and I'm going to begin reading there in Luke 21 and verse 8. Now notice what it says. And he said, "Take heed that you be not deceived, for many will come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them." Now, if we drop back to Matthew chapter 24, which is kind of a recapitulation of what we're reading in Luke 21, here's what we find in Matthew 24. Jesus is speaking to his disciples. They've asked him a question of what's going to be a sign of your coming and the end times. Notice what Jesus mentions first, just like what he mentioned in Luke chapter 21. I'm going to pick it up in Matthew 24 and verse 5. "For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." So that seems to be the first thing to look for, these false Christs. Now, we've had false Christs since Christ left the earth. We've had it throughout Christian history. But just like I told you at the beginning, the pandemic at the end of time will be greater than any other pandemic. We've obviously had pandemics throughout our history. But what's going to happen is right before Christ's second coming, each of these events will be larger than any of the events before. So when we read Revelation 6, is there any mentioning about the false Christ being the first indicator? Well, notice this at the beginning of Revelation chapter 6. I'm going to pick it up in verse 1. "And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were the noise of thunder, one of the 4 beasts saying, Come and see." Verse 2. "And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer." Now, if you read the commentaries on this, most commentators are in agreement. They believe this first rider on the white horse is a false Christ figure. Now, why the white horse symbol? Many leaders use a white horse as a symbol of their control over people. Those of us in recent history have seen the North Korean leader riding a white horse many times to bring forward this idea. And throughout history, the concept of a leader riding a white horse has been there. Who is this leader riding a white horse? Commentators state that it is likely the Antichrist figure at the end of the age. And that coincides with what Jesus says in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. The first thing to look for is this false Christ-like figure, this false leader. What's going to be different about this leader is he's going to bring cataclysmic events on this earth like we've never felt before. Oh yeah, there have been false Christs in history, but they won't match up to the false Christ that is going to come at the end of this age. Now, as we read about the second horse, watch how that coincides with what Jesus says in Luke 21, and we'll get to that right now. In Revelation 6, I'm going to pick it up here in verse 3. And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. Now, going back to Luke 21, picking up the sequence of events from Jesus there, notice what he says in verse 9 of Luke 21. But when you shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. So you see how this is lining up in order with what Revelation 6 is saying and what Luke 21, and I don't have time to go to Matthew 24, but you can read it on your own. He's saying the same thing there. Next, we see something else in this sequence. I'll pick it up in verse 5. And when he opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, "Come and see." And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." Now this is talking about a diminishment in foodstuffs. Now what does that relate to? Well, let's turn back to Luke chapter 21, and let's look at this sequence that we were following here. Notice verse 10 of Luke 21. Then said he unto them, "Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Great earthquakes will be in diverse places, and famines." Notice that. What we're reading about here with this third horseman coincides with famine. You can't get around that. Let's go further now. Let's go to 7 and 8 in Revelation 6, what we read a little bit earlier. And when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth to kill with sword, with hunger, with death or pestilence, as some translations say, and with the beasts of the earth. Now going back to Luke 21, let's pick it up in verse 11. After famines, what comes next? And pestilences and fearful signs. So we see how Jesus is mentioning of what's going to come at the end times in Matthew 24, in Luke 21, coincides like hand in glove with what we're reading in Revelation 6. Now, there's something interesting about this fourth horseman of the apocalypse, the pale horse. And it's in the end of verse 8 where it says this, "To kill with sword, with hunger, and with death, and with the wild beasts of the earth. I want to unpack that a little bit, and to do that, I'm going to go back to the 1918 to 1920 pandemic. Is there a relationship between sword, famine, and pestilence when we think about World War I? Let's go back to 1918. What led to the great pandemic of 1918? If you look at your history, if you read some books like John Barry's The Great Influenza or Laura Spinney's The Pale Horse, what you will find is the primary theory on how that pandemic began was it began on a pig farm in Haskell, Kansas. Now that's another story. I won't get into all the details of that today, but the reason is this, that men from Camp Funston in Kansas went back to Haskell County, and they were meeting with their family and friends in early 1918 as a flu influenza was raging in that county. They went back to Camp Funston in Kansas, and from there they moved to other bases throughout the United States, then on to Europe. That is the number one theory among those who study this subject as to how the pandemic began. So we see how war can lead to the expansion of a pandemic. We also see this when you think of war. What happens when an army lays siege to a city? Many times the civilian population will flee that city. And here's what happens when they flee. They go to a location where the sanitary conditions are not the same. They go to a location where they don't have the food sources that they did back in the city. Do you see how this is expanding? That war can lead to not only death on the battlefield, but it can lead to death through disease. It can lead to death through the lack of food, which is famine. Now, getting back to disease and war, did you know that out of every single individual who was killed on the battlefield during the Civil War, 2 individuals died of disease? During the Boer War, for every individual who was killed on the battlefield, 10 died due to disease. For every American who was killed during the Spanish-American War on the battlefield, 6 died due to disease. Do you see, isn't it interesting that John, writing 2,000 years ago about this relationship between the sword, the famine, and the pestilence, is knowledgeable about something with war that many people may have not been privy to at this particular time in history? Now, when we think about the sword, I've kind of played that out in relation to the 1918 to 1920 pandemic. Let's talk about the famine here. How does that relate to this combination of events that included World War I? Well, during 1915 to 1918, the people of Mount Lebanon, it was called Mount Lebanon. Lebanon was not a nation at that time. There were about 400,000 of them living in a location that is modern-day Lebanon. What happened was the Ottoman Empire, part of the Central Powers who were fighting in World War I, blockaded food moving from Syria into Lebanon because they needed it for their armies. The Allied powers blockaded Lebanon from the Mediterranean Sea, so food did not move into Lebanon from that route. Now, to make matters worse, there was a locust plague on Mount Lebanon during the years 1915 to 1918. Again, when we think about this mentioning of the wild beasts in Revelation 6 and 8, do you see the connection here to famine also? Locusts and grasshoppers, ladies and gentlemen, are wild beasts. When we think of the pestilence, what do we think of? The pig. The pig is a great incubator for viruses. The pig can take a bird virus and a human virus, reassort them in its body, and pop out a mutated virus, and that's what they believe was the pandemic that started that influenza in 1918. Do you see how the wild beasts relate to the pestilence, relate to the famine here? Well, what about the sword. What about the sword? How do the wild beasts relate to the sword here? I don't think of any wild beasts starting a war, do you? Well, wait a minute. Let's think about that for a moment. What does Revelation call that power at the end of the age? It calls it the beast power. And what is the power behind the beast? According to your Bible in Revelation 13, read the entire chapter. That old dragon, the dragon, isn't that a beast? That serpent of old, isn't that a beast? He is the power behind the beast power, and he is likened to a beast symbol. Now, he's more than a beast. He's more than a serpent. He's a great deceiver, but the Bible even talks about him as a roaring lion, seeking who he will devour. Isn't this interesting when we start to look at the details of the combination of sword, famine, and pestilence in relation to the wild beasts of the earth? We start to see some interesting things coming together when we delve into Scripture and really study it. Now remember, at the outset of today's program, I talked about a CD that was titled The Pale Horse. I don't have time to get into all the details I discuss within that CD on the specifics of what we're reading here in Revelation 6, verses 7 and 8. But if you order that CD, The Pale Horse, you will come to a greater understanding. Don't forget the other CD titled Clean and Unclean Meats, to understand that God wants us to not only not eat those meats, but not mess with their carcasses too, which can lead to outbreaks of pandemic. To get both of those items, please call us toll free at 1-888-578-8791. That's 1-888-578-8791. Or you can visit our website. Go to www.cgi.org. That's www.cgi.org and order The Pale Horse. Order unclean and clean meats. And also don't forget to download our literature at that website of www.cgi.org. Thanks for joining us on today's program. So long for now.
Armor of God and the free material offered is brought to you by the Church of God International of Tyler, Texas. You may write to us at 3900 Timms Street, Tyler, Texas 75701, or call toll-free at 1-888-578-8791, or call 1-903-939-2929 during regular business hours. You may visit our website at www.cgi.org or email us at armorofgodcgi.org. We appreciate your prayers and support.
This program is sponsored by the Church of God International and supported by our viewers.